The room is quiet now, and before we begin, I want to remind you, if you find these investigations compelling, if you want to drift deeper into the silence of strange histories with me, take a moment to like and subscribe. It helps me continue uncovering these unsettling stories. And if you are listening in the darkness, share with me in the comments where you are and what time it is as you press play tonight. The geography of our sleepless audience always fascinates me. Now, settle in, slow your breathing, and let me take you back. I first encountered the case of the Verlaine family disappearance of 1926 while combing through archival materials in Lyon. The file was nearly forgotten, buried in a section reserved for old property disputes. Yet between brittle documents of inheritance and titles, I noticed an entry that froze me in place. Maison Verlaine, occupants presumed missing, property repossessed, case unresolved. That single line became the beginning of my long descent into this mystery. The Verlaine family was not just wealthy, they were prominent. Henri Verlaine, a textile magnate, owned factories that clothed half of eastern France in the early 20th century. His name appears often in local newspapers of the era, always accompanied by words like progress, modernity, philanthropy. His wife, Amélie, was remembered for her charitable salons, where she hosted doctors, artists, even politicians. They had 3 children, 2 sons in their teens and a daughter, only 9 years old. The family's estate, a grand but somewhat austere manor on the outskirts of Grenoble, was described as both fortress and showpiece. Gray stone walls, tall shuttered windows, a house meant to endure centuries. And then, in the spring of 1926, they vanished. The records are infuriatingly incomplete. No bodies, no surviving eyewitness to the precise moment, just the absence of the family and the silence that followed. The estate stood untouched, its tables set for a dinner no one finished, servants dismissed without explanation, neighbors whispering about strange lights on the grounds in the nights leading up to their disappearance. It is this silence that I find most oppressive. In most disappearances, there are witnesses. Someone sees the carriage, the motor car, the train. But here, in the Verlaine disappearance, there is only the abrupt severing of their presence from the world. When I first visited the estate, now crumbling and hidden behind encroaching trees, I remember the sensation of standing before the windows. Dust and ivy obscured most of the view, but through one cracked pane I glimpsed a dining room still faintly ordered. A long table, high-backed chairs, shadows leaning into corners. It was as if the family had stepped out for a walk and simply never returned. The initial investigation, as recorded in sparse police files, leaned toward the possibility of voluntary disappearance, a family fleeing debts or political entanglements. But the Verlaine accounts were solid, their name still respected, and no evidence suggested the burden of ruin. Still, the officials preferred that theory. To admit a family of such stature could be spirited away without noise or trace was unthinkable. I began tracing the accounts of locals. One gardener, interviewed in 1927, recalled the youngest daughter, Elise, standing at the orchard fence one dusk, clutching a rag doll. She asked him if he had seen the tall visitors. He laughed, thinking she meant her uncles. But she insisted, describing them as strangers who came only at night, moving silently through the trees. This detail never entered the police record. As I dig deeper, I sense the weight of omission. Diaries from neighboring families mention carriages on the lane after midnight, long after the Verlaine gates were locked. A nun at the convent school wrote of Elise arriving one morning pale and shaking, reluctant to speak. "The girl carries shadows," she noted. Piece by piece, the narrative begins to darken. What strikes me most is the absence of follow-up. By the early 1930s, the property was quietly repossessed by creditors, as though the family had simply dissolved. Newspapers stopped printing their name. It was as if Henri Verlaine and his family had been collectively erased, leaving behind only legal paperwork. But in the margins of forgotten files, the story whispers. The dismissed cook claimed she heard chanting from the library late at night. though she was told never to enter that wing. The stable boy described locked crates being unloaded at odd hours, their contents concealed. And then there is the final letter, unsigned, never sent, discovered in the desk of Henri Verlaine. Written in a hurried, uneven hand, it reads, "If anything befalls us, it is not by chance. Watch the cellar. The walls remember." I have held that letter. The ink, browned with age, still carries the tremor of desperation. As night deepens, while I recount this to you, I think of that phrase, "the walls remember." It lingers in my mind like an echo, pulling me toward what lies beneath the manor, what the investigations of the time refused to touch. And so the story begins not with evidence, but with absence. A whole family swallowed, their presence erased, their home standing as a shell. The case of the Verlaine disappearance is one of suffocation by silence, and in that silence, I begin my search. The cellar. That single word has clung to me since I first encountered the Verlaine file. In the neat, official reports, the cellar is barely mentioned, as though the officers considered it irrelevant. A note from April 1926 reads, "Cellar inspected, wine casks in order, no irregularity observed." The statement is clinical, almost dismissive, but the letter in Henri's desk urges otherwise. When I requested access to the surviving photographs of the estate, I found only 6 images, all grainy, taken by a police photographer with an unsteady hand. 3 showed the exterior, 1 the grand staircase, 1 the abandoned dining room, and 1, curiously, a corner of the cellar. It is poorly lit, but there is something about the angle that unsettled me. A wall, thick stone, and along its surface a faint discoloration, a line that curves where no natural seam should. The officer had not described it, and no report comments on it. Yet in the photograph it lingers, like a scar in the architecture. I began to reconstruct the days leading up to the disappearance. Testimonies from household staff are brief, but together they paint an image of unease. The cook, dismissed a week before the family vanished, told investigators she believed the family was changing in spirit. Meals requested grew irregular, elaborate feasts for a table of 12, though only 5 lived in the manor. One night she overheard murmurs from the dining hall, though she swore no guests had entered. The butler, older and more cautious, claimed Henri had forbidden him from entering the cellar entirely in the final months. He complied, but in his statement, he admitted hearing noises beneath the floorboards late at night, a slow scraping followed by silence. When he pressed his ear to the stone stairwell, the sound stopped. None of these accounts appear in the official summary. They survive only in scraps of testimony, tucked away in appendices rarely read. What presses on me most are the stories of Élise, the youngest child. She seemed particularly disturbed in those last weeks. A diary entry from her governess records a troubling scene. Élise refused to sleep in her bedroom, insisting that figures stood at her window, whispering through the glass, though it was 3 floors above the ground. When coaxed to explain, she repeated the phrase, "They wait below, they wait where it is cold." These fragments pull me further into the cellar. During one of my visits to Grenoble, I managed to locate the grandson of a mason who had worked on the estate decades before the disappearance. Over coffee in a dim cafe, the man told me what his grandfather had passed down. The manor, he said, had been built atop the foundations of something older, remnants of a medieval structure, a priory perhaps, long fallen to ruin. The foundations were never fully cleared. Instead, they were absorbed, hidden behind the newer walls. You could walk those cellars, the grandson said, and not know which stones belonged to the Verlaine and which belonged to something far older. That unsettled me deeply, because Henri's final note, "The walls remember," now sounded less metaphorical. Theories circulated, of course. A local historian speculated the Verlaine family staged their own disappearance to escape some scandal not preserved in public record. Another whispered theory suggested they were taken by political rivals or by criminals targeting their wealth. But I find both unconvincing. There were no ransom notes, no traces of departure. The manor itself spoke louder than speculation. I remember my first descent into that cellar. By then, the estate was nearly a ruin. The upper floors unsafe, windows shattered, ivy choking the stone. With permission from the municipality, I stepped down the stairwell. The air was colder, heavier, as though it held on to decades of silence. My lantern threw long shadows over the casks, the shelves of dust-shrouded bottles, the narrow corridor leading to the discolored wall I had seen in the photograph. And there, faintly, I could see it still. A curve, almost like the outline of an archway, long sealed. When I pressed my hand to it, the stone was damp. I stayed there for some time, listening. The quiet was complete until I became aware of something stranger, a faint, hollow echo when I tapped the wall. Solid stone should not answer like that. It was as if there was a cavity beyond, a hidden chamber. The Verlaine police report had not mentioned this. I left the cellar with a weight on my chest, certain now that Henry's note was no flourish of fear. He was directing attention to something deliberately concealed, something the investigations of his time had either overlooked or ignored. Back in the archives, I returned to the last known records of the family's movements. The final evening described in witness accounts was the 12th of May, 1926. The governess had departed earlier that day. A delivery boy claimed he brought crates of wine to the kitchen entrance, but was told to leave them outside the gate. He saw no one enter or exit. Neighbors reported lights burning in the windows late into the night, and then, after midnight, nothing. The house stood dark, and by morning the family was gone. The abruptness chills me. The dining room table was found set, plates aligned as though dinner had been prepared. A meal interrupted. Yet no remnants of food were discovered, no spilled glasses, no signs of struggle, only a silence too sudden to be natural. As I close part 2 of this investigation, I leave you with this thought. A sealed arch in a cellar, a child whispering about figures waiting in the cold below, and a father's final note hidden in his desk. Each detail on its own is disquieting. Together, they form a pattern of erasure, as if the family had been consumed not by flight, nor by violence in the ordinary sense, but by something that waited beneath their own home. And the cellar, patient in its stone silence, still holds whatever truth remains. The cellar haunted me long after I returned from Grenoble. I kept returning to Henri's last words, "Watch the cellar, the walls remember." If he left this as a warning, then someone, perhaps even the authorities, chose to ignore it. The official investigation circled the house, peered through its windows, but never truly descended into its depths. I traced the early reports carefully. Officers noted the condition of the dining room, the library, the master bedroom. They cataloged the servants dismissed weeks earlier, the unpaid bills for food deliveries, the absence of signs of violence. Yet when I searched for a detailed description of the cellar, I found only one sentence: no irregularity observed. That omission gnawed at me. What had they chosen not to write, or what had they seen and quietly erased? As I sifted through additional documents, handwritten statements by neighbors, scraps of testimony preserved in fragile ink, I began to notice a peculiar consistency. Each time someone mentioned the cellar, their words were abbreviated, clipped, as though the matter was too uncomfortable to expand upon. A neighbor, for example, told police she saw workers carrying crates down the cellar stairs long after midnight. The note ends abruptly, subject unwilling to elaborate. Unwilling or prevented? I requested access to regional newspapers of 1926, hoping that the disappearance of such a prominent family might have made headlines. Strangely, there was almost nothing. One short article, printed weeks later, mentioned the mysterious absence of the Verlaine family, but offered no detail. Then silence, as if the press had been discouraged from speaking further. It was only when I visited a private collector, a man who specialized in forbidden or suppressed material, that I uncovered something more disturbing. In his collection was a thin pamphlet, never widely circulated, that hinted at strange gatherings held at the Verlaine Manor in early 1926. The author, an anonymous pamphleteer with a taste for scandal, described music heard late at night, voices chanting in unfamiliar cadences, and visitors cloaked in black entering the house under cover of darkness. The pamphlet was derided at the time as rumor-mongering, but reading it now, after the silence of the archives, I felt a prickle of unease. If even half of it was true, then Henry Verlaine had opened his home to practices few in that era would admit to. The cellar, I realized, was not merely a storage of wine. It might have been a place of gathering, of ritual. When I returned again to the ruins, this thought pressed heavily upon me. The sealed arch no longer looked like the flaw of old masonry. It resembled something deliberately closed, as though a chamber had been locked away. I ran my lantern across the curve again, noting faint impressions in the mortar, symbols scratched into the stone. Age had blurred them, but I could still discern their circular pattern etched with a trembling hand. They were not marks left by masons. They were deliberate inscriptions. That night, as I left the estate and walked back through the silent woods, I found myself listening for sounds I could not name. The air seemed charged, as though the stones themselves pressed forward with memory. Later, in my lodging, I read a diary entry belonging to Amélie Verlaine. It had been salvaged by distant relatives and passed eventually into the archives. Most of her writing is trivial, notes on social visits, fabric purchases, the health of the children. But on the evening of April 28th, just 2 weeks before the disappearance, she wrote, "Henri insists upon continuing the meetings below. I cannot rest. Elise cries each night, claiming she hears them through the floors. If he will not stop, then God help us, for I fear the walls drink in every word." Her words confirmed the whispers. There had been meetings, and she feared them. I began to see the case less as a sudden disappearance and more as a slow descent, one that culminated in the family being swallowed by what they had invited into their home. Psychologically, this struck me hardest when I considered the children. The eldest son, Jules, had been enrolled at a boarding school but was withdrawn in March, 2 months before the family vanished. No reason was recorded. The headmaster, in a letter preserved in the school's ledger, noted, "The boy expressed dread of returning to the cellar of his home. He claimed it was not their house anymore." It is difficult to describe the chill that runs through me when I imagine that phrase, "not their house anymore." At what point does a place, brick and stone, turn against those who inhabit it? I picture that manor in its last weeks. Windows shuttered, servants gone, a family retreating inward, meals prepared for unseen guests, the cellar sealed yet restless beneath, neighbors whispering of figures in the trees, children pale and sleepless, a mother writing pleas in her diary, and a father leaving a final note hidden in his desk. What the police called disappearance, I am beginning to see as transformation, of a family, of a home, of silence thickening into erasure. By the close of Part 3, I can no longer treat the Verlaine disappearance as an ordinary case of flight or crime. Something else entered that house, something that left no bodies, no footprints, only a void. And in that void, I must listen. For the walls remember. To understand what happened in May of 1926, I had to attempt the impossible, to reconstruct the final night of the Verlaine family. The archives offer no full account, only fragments, statements given reluctantly, notes made hastily, and a few diary entries left unfinished. Yet when aligned carefully, they form a faint outline, a silhouette of the last hours. It begins, I believe, just after dusk on the 12th of May. Neighbors reported smoke rising from the manor's chimneys and the faint smell of roasting meat drifting into the orchards. Dinner was being prepared. The dining table, when discovered later, confirmed this. Plates arranged, glasses placed, chairs aligned as if for guests, but no food remained. No scraps, no stains, nothing but porcelain and silverware set in waiting. At approximately 9 o'clock, a farmhand passing by the eastern fence told investigators he saw lantern light moving from the stables to the side entrance of the manor. He assumed deliveries were being carried inside, though he saw no wagon, only the movement of two figures. His statement ends with a peculiar note. He heard music, not the lilting sound of a piano or gramophone, but low, droning tones that he described as like a horn held too long. The investigators dismissed this as imagination. Around the same time, the governess, though formally dismissed, later confided to her priest that she returned secretly to the manor that evening to retrieve belongings she had left behind. She swore in the sanctity of confession that she saw lights blazing in every window and heard voices chanting in unison. When pressed, she described the sound as neither French nor Latin, but something she did not recognize. She fled before entering. Her testimony never entered the police files. I discovered it only in parish records. By 10 o'clock, the household would have gathered in the dining room. I picture them there, Henri at the head of the table, Amélie seated opposite, the three children between them. But were they alone? The chairs suggest not. 12 places were set. That number has troubled me ever since. Who were the other 7? The cook had spoken of visitors at night. The pamphlet hinted at gatherings. Amelie's diary mentioned meetings below. I imagined then that on this night, the dining table was not simply for family. Others were expected or had already arrived. At 11, a carriage was heard by 2 villagers, its wheels muffled by the dirt road leading to the manor. They did not see it, but they swore they heard it pause near the gate. When they looked the next morning, no tracks remained. Midnight. The final hour in which the Verlaine family was ever seen alive. A neighbor awoke to what she described as an unearthly brightness emanating from the manor grounds. She thought it was fire, but no smoke followed. The light, she said, was pale, not orange, and it pulsed like a heartbeat. Within minutes, darkness returned. By morning, the house was silent. Windows black, doors locked, no voices, no servants, no trace. When investigators entered days later, they found no evidence of departure. The beds unslept, the children's toys scattered as though interrupted in play, the dining room waiting for a meal that was never eaten, and in the cellar, only that sealed wall already old, yet humming with implication. What unsettles me most is not simply the family's absence, but the manner of it. No clothes missing, no money withdrawn, no carriage or automobile departed. To vanish in such completeness suggests not escape, but absorption. I return again and again to Amélie's words, "If he will not stop, then God help us, for I fear the walls drink in every word." The walls, thick, ancient, built on older stone. Were they witnesses or participants? Some nights, as I read these fragments aloud in my study, I find myself imagining the soundscape of that night. The low horn, the murmured chants, the heartbeat light that bathed the manor. And beneath it all, the cellar waiting, the sealed arch aching against its stone confines. One document haunts me more than the others. It is a report filed not by police, but by a municipal worker tasked with inspecting the property weeks later. In dry bureaucratic language, he notes, "No sign of life, manor silent, cellar damp, unexplained warmth emanating from sealed wall, though no furnace nearby." Warmth. I close my eyes and picture it. The investigators tapping the wall, dismissing it, but one worker feeling it radiate against his palm. What lives behind stone that should be cold? I believe the family gathered at the table that night not for dinner, but for something else. Perhaps ritual. Perhaps compulsion. Perhaps both. And at the stroke of midnight, whatever waited below answered. This is, of course, speculation. But when silence is all that remains, speculation is the only bridge. As I move deeper into this investigation, one question hardens like stone. Did the Verlaine family open a door that night, or were they themselves the door? The manor still stands, weathered and broken, but each time I stand before it, I feel the weight of that night pressing outward. The walls, yes, they remember, and memory is never passive. The sealed arch became my obsession. I could not move forward without confronting it, because every clue circled back to that damp curve of stone. Henri's note, Amélie's diary, Elise's whispers of cold figures below, all pointed downward. Yet the authorities of 1926 had chosen not to act, or perhaps they had acted, and the record of it was erased. In the municipal archives, after days of patient searching, I found a reference almost overlooked, a requisition form dated June 1926, authorizing minor structural work on the Verlaine property. The request was signed not by the police, but by a contractor linked to the Ministry of the Interior. The description was vague: inspection of foundations, reinforcement of masonry. No report followed, no invoice, just the authorization, and then silence. What were they reinforcing? Determined to learn more, I sought out the descendants of that contractor. An elderly woman, his granddaughter, received me in a narrow apartment in Lyon. She was reluctant at first, but when I mentioned the Verlaine estate, she frowned and fetched a box of her grandfather's papers. Inside, I found sketches, rough, smudged with charcoal, but unmistakable. The cellar, the arch, and beyond it, a chamber. My breath caught when I saw the notes scribbled at the margins. Hollow space, stones not original, odor of damp earth, ordered sealed. He had opened it. I asked if her grandfather ever spoke of it. She nodded slowly. He said it was not a cellar, she whispered. He said it was older than the house, older than the town. And he said it did not want to be disturbed. Her words lodged deep inside me. Legends of the land around Grenoble are sparse but persistent. Some speak of abandoned monasteries, others of pagan sites suppressed by the church. A local folklorist I consulted told me the hill on which the Verlaine estate stands was once called La Colline de Veilleurs, the Hill of Watchers. He could not trace the origin of the name, only that it appeared in records as far back as the 14th century, and then fell out of use. The Watchers. That phrase, combined with Elise's childish description of tall visitors, troubled me. Were these echoes of the same memory passed across centuries, resurfacing in a frightened child's mind? I returned to the manor again, lantern in hand, intent on studying the arch more closely. Dust clung to the air, and the steps groaned under my weight. At the base of the cellar, I placed my palm once more against the stone. Cold this time, but with a faint vibration as if the wall held its breath. My lantern flickered, shadows shifting across the mortar lines. For a moment I felt certain something stood just beyond, listening as I listened. I do not say this lightly. I am a man of documents, of testimony, of careful reconstruction. But there in the cellar, all my rational frameworks faltered. It felt less like an investigation and more like a negotiation with the house itself. That night, I dreamed of the Verlaine dining room, 12 chairs, shadows seated where faces should be, and the cellar door at the far end, open, leading into blackness. When I woke, my throat was raw, as if I had been calling names in my sleep. Psychologically, the sealed chamber became a mirror. For Henri, perhaps, it was both a lure and a terror. Why else would he forbid his staff to enter? Why else would he leave his final note pointing toward it? I imagine him pacing in that cellar, torn between fear and compulsion, the sense that something demanded attention from behind the wall. The archival contractor's sketches confirm what I already suspected. The chamber was opened briefly and then closed, ordered sealed, as though whatever lay beyond was not meant for daylight. But why seal it at all, rather than document it, unless the discovery itself was considered dangerous? The folklorist offered one more fragment before I departed. In a brittle manuscript, he found reference to rituals once performed on the Hill of Watchers, rites of keeping, of binding. Not worship, he said, but containment. Something was kept beneath. Containment. The word unsettles me more than worship ever could. Worship implies reverence, choice. Containment implies fear. By the end of Part 5, the Verlaine case no longer feels like a story of simple disappearance. It feels like a relay. Each generation building over something older, each wall layered to hide what should remain hidden. Henri, knowingly or not, disturbed that balance. His family paid the price. And the walls, as he warned, remember. The contractor's sketches changed everything. They proved the chamber had been breached and deliberately concealed again. What unsettled me most was not only that discovery, but the handwriting at the edge of the drawings. By order of prefecture, do not reopen. I traced the authorization number on the requisition form. It led not to the local office in Grenoble, but to the Ministry of the Interior in Paris. Why would a disappearance in a provincial town warrant intervention from the capital? Families went missing often enough, even wealthy ones. But here, officials had involved themselves in masonry, in stone. In the National Archives, I requested files from 1926. What I received was a single envelope, its contents pared down almost to nothing. A summary sheet declaring the Verlaine matter resolved administratively, and one page stamped confidentiel. It read, "Structural anomalies corrected. Property to remain sealed until further notice. No public disclosure required." No mention of the family. No mention of their fate. Only the structure. The house itself had become the subject of state concern. I began to suspect that what happened to the Verlaine family was not ignored, but intentionally erased. When I pressed further, archivists warned me quietly, "Some files are not here. They are held elsewhere and they do not open." The phrase chilled me. They do not open. Not cannot, but do not. One archivist, after a long pause, slipped me a hint. He suggested I search in the military archives, specifically under civil engineering reports from the interwar years. Sometimes, he said, things are reclassified. I followed his advice. In a dusty ledger, misfiled among bridge assessments and tunnel inspections, I found a line item marked Grenoble, private estate, unstable substructure, containment advised. The date matched the disappearance. The language was dry, but I recognized it for what it was, an official acknowledgement that something beneath the manor required containment. Containment, again. The same word used by the folklorist when describing ancient rituals on the hill. The implications are difficult to dismiss. Was the state aware, even then, that the Verlaine estate sat upon a site of older significance? Did they intervene not to investigate a family, but to protect against something below? As I wrestled with these questions, I returned to Amélie's diary, to her plea that the walls in every word. I wondered if the gatherings Henri hosted had caught the attention of authorities. Perhaps whispers reached Paris that a respected industrialist was dabbling in forbidden practices, reviving rights meant to remain buried. A scandal like that could not be allowed to erupt in public. Better to seal it, literally and figuratively, than to explain. If so, the family were casualties not only of their own choices, but of a system that preferred silence to truth. Psychologically, this realization is devastating. It suggests their disappearance was acknowledged at the highest levels, but reframed, suppressed, and quietly abandoned. Their neighbors were left with rumors, their descendants with questions, and the house with its silence. The deeper I go, the more I feel the case tightening around two competing explanations. Either the Verlaine family invoked something in their cellar and were consumed by it, or they fell victim to a cover-up, a deliberate sealing of knowledge by a government unwilling to risk disclosure. Perhaps disturbingly, both. One document I found hints at this intersection. A memorandum from a colonel to his superior dated July 1926 reads, "Operation completed, sealing maintained, no further disturbances reported. Recommend continued surveillance of site." Surveillance. Even after the chamber was closed, they continued to watch. Who or what did they fear might return? When I visited the hill again, the manor sagging like a hollow shell, I walked its perimeter. Rusted stakes jutted from the soil in regular intervals as though some crude fence had once been erected. Beyond them, trees leaned inward, branches interlaced, forming a canopy that darkened the ground. Standing there, I felt watched, though the house behind me stood empty. The Verlaine disappearance is no longer just a private tragedy. It is a nexus of forces, personal, political, perhaps even supernatural. Henri's final note was not simply a warning to his family, but perhaps to anyone who might one day pry into the walls. Still, I cannot let go. Because somewhere beneath those stones lies the chamber, hidden yet alive, a cavity sealed in haste and fear. If the walls remember, then what memory were they forced to keep hidden? As Part 6 closes, I hold in my hands documents stamped confidentiel, contractor sketches never meant to surface, and the weight of a silence preserved by both family and state. The deeper I search, the clearer it becomes. The truth was not lost. It was buried. And now, nearly a century later, I find myself at the edge of that burial, listening to what stirs beneath. To be continued in Part 7. The historian's task is often to sift through the debris of thought, scraps of paper, hesitant sentences written in ink that bleeds through thin stock. In Henry Verlaine's case, these fragments are all that remain of his voice. Among the sealed packet of family belongings preserved in the departmental archives, I discovered a series of letters written not to business associates or relatives, but to himself. Drafts of confessions, perhaps, or attempts at exorcism through language. They were undated, unsigned, but unmistakably his hand. The earliest carried a veneer of control. I do not believe in the mutterings of peasants, nor in the warnings of friars. Yet when the stone was disturbed, I felt an air that was not air, a current that made the lamps tremble though no wind passed. I tell myself it is nothing but hollow earth, yet it lingers in me. I hear it when I try to sleep, the faintest rasping, like a voice swallowed by the wall. Even here, the rational mind clung to explanation, hollow earth, drafts, the materialist's comfort. But as the letters progress, reassurance erodes. They look to me for guidance, Amelie and the children, but I am hollowing. Every night I descend with the candle, telling myself it is inspection of masonry, nothing more. Yet I speak aloud to the stones as though they might reply. I cannot stop myself. There is in these lines the tremor of obsession. The industrialist accustomed to mastery now bends to his own basement, compelled by forces he cannot name. Later fragments darken further. I traced the carvings today. They form no language I know, yet my hand completes them without instruction. The chalk breaks. I continue with ash. When I wake in the mornings, I find the marks under my nails. Who moves my hand in the night? The descent into mania is clear. It is the psychology of possession, though Henry never uses that word. Instead, he rationalizes, rephrases, invents new excuses. He calls it curiosity, study, discipline. But in the margins of these drafts, single words repeat: containment, silence, binding. At times, Henry attempts resistance. I will wall it again. Tonight I will take mortar and stone and undo the breach. Yet already I know I shall falter, for when I think of sealing it, I hear a low note like a horn, sounding through the marrow of the house. How can stone sing? His struggle mirrors the folklorist's accounts of ritual duty, the necessity of binding what stirs beneath. But Henry is no ritualist. He approaches it like an engineer, a pragmatist with the wrong tools. And so he falters. Psychologists who have studied obsession often note its cyclical nature. Moments of resolve collapse into relapse, driven by the very act of suppression. Henry's letters embody this cycle. One page vows an end, the next confesses return. This will be the last descent. Followed immediately, days later, by went again. I could not resist. It called. The family, too, begins to enter the writings. Amélie, once the figure of warmth, appears now as both anchor and danger. She watches me with sorrow. She asks what I do in the cellar. I tell her it is for the safety of the house. This is not wholly untrue. Yet if she knew what I hear, she would not remain calm. I must protect her from it. But if she continues to press me, I may be forced to let her see. Then she will believe. Then she will fear as I do. The thought is chilling, that Henry considered drawing his wife and children into his secret, not to protect them, but to validate his unraveling mind. One final fragment stands apart. Unlike the others, it is written in a hurried scrawl, the ink blotched, the page half torn. I dreamed the walls open, and we are taken into them. No struggle, no scream, only the folding of plaster as though it were cloth. I woke, yet the impression remained, the outline of bodies pressed into stone. If this is dream, it is not mine alone. When I read these words, I thought of Amélie's diary. The walls drink in every word. Husband and wife, writing in separate pages, spoke the same imagery: walls that absorb, that hold, that remember. From a psychological standpoint, Henry's writings reveal a classic case of obsessional psychosis. Yet layered atop the folklore, the architectural anomalies, and the state's later intervention, the diagnosis feels incomplete. To reduce his descent to madness alone ignores the consistency of the imagery across witnesses. If he hallucinated, then Amélie hallucinated in tandem. If he dreamed of the walls consuming them, she too dreamt of voices whispering through them. And the Masons years later recorded hearing groans in the stone. Were all of them diluted across decades? As I fold Henry's letters back into their brittle envelope, I cannot help but feel that he was not only documenting his own fall, but leaving a map. Each phrase, containment, silence, binding, is a marker pointing towards something larger, something he half understood but could not name. The tragedy of Henri Verlaine may be that he recognized the danger too late. His writing suggests a man caught between duty to seal what was uncovered and temptation to pursue its secrets. In the end, he chose neither decisively, and the family paid the price. When I leave the archives that evening, the city lights of Grenoble glow against the mountains. But I find myself glancing at the shadows between buildings, at the spaces where walls press close. For once you have read a man's confession of being consumed by his own house, you cannot look at stone the same way again. Every disappearance leaves an echo in those who stood just beyond the threshold. For the Verlaine family, that echo survives in testimonies from the surrounding village and in the correspondence of cousins who lived close enough to witness the decline, but too distant to intervene. The archival record is fractured. Brief notes in parish registers, reminiscences written decades later, letters yellowed with age. Yet woven together, they form a portrait of a household slowly separating from the world as though walls were rising not just of stone, but of silence. One cousin, Élise de Montbrun, described in a 1931 letter, "When I last visited Amélie, she seemed diminished, as though carrying some invisible weight. She spoke little, but when I asked after Henri, her eyes moved to the ceiling as if listening for something above us. I thought perhaps he was pacing the upper hall, but the house was silent. She only whispered, 'He is always below now.' The phrase, 'always below,' would repeat in several accounts. Servants dismissed one after another recalled Henri's nightly descents into the cellar, candle in hand, returning only at dawn. They said his clothes carried the scent of damp stone, and his fingers were often blackened with ash. By 1929, few locals would accept employment at the estate. One coachman lasted 3 weeks before refusing to return, claiming that when he waited in the carriage yard after midnight, he heard a second set of footsteps following Henri back up the cellar stairs, though no one else emerged. The villagers, practical folk hardened by generations of superstition, began to whisper that the Verlaine house was taking after its master. They meant, perhaps, that Henri's madness infected the walls themselves, making the estate uncanny. Yet some accounts suggest they meant it literally. An elderly seamstress, called occasionally to mend the children's clothes, remembered that young Lucien once asked her if the wall faces were kinder in her cottage. When she asked what he meant, he pointed to a crack near the window and whispered, "They watch when Papa is below." There is tragedy in these small recollections. Children speaking what adults dare not, their fears dismissed as fancies until too late. Amélie, for her part, appeared increasingly spectral in the village. One grocer recalled her coming to market with her hair unpinned, carrying coins she seemed not to recognize. She held them up to the light, turning them over as though expecting to see writing hidden on the surface. When asked if she was well, she replied only, "The stones carry more than weight." It is telling that, despite such signs, the wider family did not intervene. Letters reveal concern, yes, but also hesitation, fear of scandal, reluctance to confront what might be madness. One uncle wrote plainly, "Better to let Henri exhaust his folly than draw official eyes to the estate." Business would not endure the shadow of lunacy. Thus the Verlaine family was left to collapse inward, unobserved. One of the last clear outside testimonies comes from a parish boy, employed briefly as errand runner. He remembered delivering a basket of bread at dusk. As he approached the door, he heard voices not raised in argument but chanting, low and rhythmic. It was not French, nor any language he knew. Peering through a side window, he glimpsed the family gathered at the cellar door, Henri leading, Amélie behind, the children clasping hands. Their mouths moved in unison. The boy dropped the basket and fled. Decades later, when interviewed by regional historians, he insisted he still remembered the cadence of the chant. He hummed it, a rising and falling drone, closer to breath than speech. He said it haunted him in dreams, the way one forgets words but not the shape of a melody. By late 1929, correspondence from relatives ceases. The family no longer traveled, no longer received guests. Those who approached were told the Verlaine household was indisposed. The estate shutters remained closed, even in summer. And then, silence. The final trace is a brief notice in the prefectural archive, a request filed by distant cousins in early 1930, seeking inquiry into the welfare of the family after months of unanswered letters. Officials arrived to find the estate intact, but empty. Table set, hearth cold, doors unbarred, no sign of struggle, no bodies, only walls heavy with their own stillness. The testimonies of villagers and relatives thus stand as the last living witnesses to the family's slow vanishing. They speak of footsteps, of whispers, of a man pulled into ritual and a wife resigned to dread. They show us not an abrupt disappearance, but a fading, the steady absorption of a household into its own architecture. And yet even here, one cannot dismiss the possibility of choice. Did the family succumb unwillingly, or did they cross the threshold together, hand in hand, as the parish boy's vision suggests? The line between victim and participant blurs. For now, all that remains is the echo of those who stood outside, listening to the walls. The Verlaine disappearance entered the official record on February 12, 1930, when a formal petition by distant cousins finally compelled the prefecture of Haute-Saône to dispatch investigators to the estate. The file remains in departmental archives, a thin sheaf of papers bound with string. Its tone is bureaucratic, but beneath the phrasing one can feel the inspector's unease. The first report begins. Arrived at the Verlaine property at 10:15 hours. Weather clear, premises locked yet not barred. No response to repeated summons at door. Entry obtained without damage. Initial impression, abandonment, yet absence of disorder. That phrase, absence of disorder, would repeat across their notes. Nothing appeared ransacked. Nothing suggested flight. The house was simply vacant, as if the inhabitants had stepped out only moments before. In the dining room, the table remained set for 6. Plates bore the faint traces of a meal untouched, cutlery aligned, glasses polished. A candlestick had guttered out halfway, wax hardened mid-drip. One inspector observed that no food showed signs of decay, as though the meal had been prepared and left within days, not weeks. Clocks throughout the house had stopped at different hours. One in the parlor halted at 3:17. Another in the master bedroom at 4:02. When wound, they resumed without difficulty. Why they had ceased simultaneously yet at different times remained unexplained. Upstairs, beds bore the imprint of bodies, sheets turned down, yet no personal belongings were missing. Clothing hung in wardrobes, shoes aligned beneath, passports, papers, jewelry, all remained untouched. It was as though the family had departed without preparation, without taking anything to sustain a journey. The cellar proved most troubling. Inspectors descended with lanterns. They found the chamber dry, its stone walls intact. Against the far wall lay remnants of burnt parchment, indecipherable scraps too charred to preserve. A circle of soot marked the floor, its edges faint but deliberate. One inspector, in a margin note, wrote, "Arrangement resembles ritual, though purpose unclear. Witnesses in village have spoken of strange chanting. Recommend further inquiry." Yet no further inquiry was undertaken. The only objects of note were 3 chairs arranged in a line facing the wall. Upon each rested a child's toy, a wooden horse, a doll, a small drum. The placement felt deliberate, yet no record explains its significance. No blood, no signs of struggle, no forced exit. The cellar door could only be barred from within, yet was found unlatched. The official conclusion issued weeks later was unsatisfactory even to those who wrote it. The whereabouts of the Verlaine family remain unknown. No evidence suggests crime or voluntary flight. It is possible that illness, delusion, or pact contributed to collective disappearance. No further action recommended unless new evidence arises. The file closes there. No new evidence ever arose. The estate remained sealed for months, then quietly transferred to relatives who refused to inhabit it. Eventually it passed to distant claimants, and then to neglect. By mid-century it was abandoned, the roof sagging, windows empty sockets. Still, the inspector's testimony lingers. In later years, 2 of them gave private accounts diverging from the official record. One confessed to a colleague that, while in the cellar, he heard what he described as breathing through stone, a faint exhalation that seemed to issue from the walls themselves. Another recalled the uncanny stillness of the house, as if air itself were suspended, waiting. Neither detail made its way into the final file. Bureaucracy tolerates mystery only in silence. For the record, the Verlaine family simply vanished. No bodies, no belongings, no witnesses. And yet, when one reads the reports closely, a different impression emerges. Not disappearance, but absorption. The family did not leave. They remained, in some sense, within those walls. By the mid-1930s, the Verlaine estate had fallen into neglect. Its windows, once lit during evening gatherings, stared empty toward the fields. Roof tiles slipped one by one into the soil. The gates sagged on their hinges. Though the prefecture considered the matter closed, the villagers of Saint-Romain carried the wound in memory. No one wished to walk past after nightfall. Cattle driven near the hedgerows balked, refusing to move forward. Hunters detoured rather than cross the grounds. The estate became an island of silence, set apart by fear. The stories began quietly at first, murmured around the tavern, muttered during harvest. A lantern seen swinging in an upstairs room, though no one had entered for years. A sound like children laughing, faint, carried across the fields on windless nights. Then came bolder claims. A woman's figure drifting along the balcony rail, her face veiled in shadow. In 1938, a pair of vagrants broke into the house, seeking shelter. They were discovered the next morning wandering the road barefoot, clothes torn, eyes unfocused. One spoke only of faces in the walls. The other never spoke again. The villagers took it as confirmation of what they had long believed. The family had not departed. They lingered. During the war years, soldiers billeted nearby dared to enter. In a letter preserved by a local priest, a lieutenant wrote, "The house is cold beyond weather. Lamps will not hold their flame within the walls. One of my men swore he heard a child humming beneath the floorboards." His unit departed after only one night. By the 1950s, the estate was little more than ruin, yet its presence continued to unsettle. Children dared one another to touch the gates, but few crossed them. Shepherds swore their flocks strayed wide, circling as if compelled to avoid unseen boundaries. It was then the legends took deeper root. Some claimed the Verlaine family had performed a final ritual, binding themselves to the property. Others whispered they had been taken, not by man, but by something older, a force that absorbed their presence. Each telling shifted, but all agreed on one point. The estate was not empty. When I first visited the region decades later, I carried only the prefectural file. Yet what struck me most was not the paper trail of bureaucrats, but the way villagers lowered their voices when speaking of the house. They used no names, only gestures, a tilt of the chin toward the distant grove, a narrowing of the eyes. To them, it was not history, but a wound still open. I spoke with a woman then in her 70s who recalled walking with her father past the estate at dusk. She remembered him pausing, pressing her hand tightly and whispering, "Do not look at the windows." When I asked why, she shook her head. Because they look back. Others told of lights that flickered in the cellar long after the roof had collapsed, of sounds like whispered prayer echoing through the hedgerows, of a weight in the air, thick and damp, that settled on the skin whenever one strayed too close. There were those who insisted it was nothing but imagination, a story passed from mouth to mouth embroidered with fear. Yet even the skeptics refused to linger near the grounds at night. The estate had become more than a ruin. It was a vessel of memory, layered with silence and rumor until fact and legend intertwined. The family's absence had created a vacuum, and the villagers filled it with story. In archives, the Verlaine case remains a thin dossier of unanswered questions. But in the village, it is a living ghost, passed down in whispers, its details shifting with each generation. And as I listened to these voices, I began to sense what the inspectors had not recorded, what the official file omitted. The estate itself seemed to breathe. It was late autumn when I first stood before the Verlaine gates. The ironwork had rusted to the color of dried blood, one hinge sagging, the other locked stiff with time. The path beyond was choked with weeds and nettles. A windless stillness hung over the ground, as though even the air refused to stir within those borders. I hesitated, listening. The village road behind me lay empty, no voices, no passing cart. The world seemed to fall away. At last I pushed the gate. Metal shrieked softly, then yielded. I stepped inside. The garden had long surrendered to bramble. Roots clawed through the gravel. Stone statues, figures of saints and scholars, leaned askew, their features eroded until they seemed to grimace. I passed them in silence, moving toward the house. The facade rose out of the gloom like a husk. Shutters dangled loose. Windows gaped, glassless, as if the house itself had been hollowed from within. A single crow perched on the balcony rail, watching me without sound. Inside, the air struck me first, damp, metallic, touched with rot. My lamp beam cut through layers of dust, wallpaper peeled in strips, curling like old parchment. The floors creaked underfoot, boards flexing as though aware of my weight. I moved slowly from room to room. In the dining hall, the long table still stood, though warped with mildew. A few chairs remained upright, arranged as if awaiting their owners. Plates lay scattered, fused with dust, their rims faintly gilded. I found myself pausing, imagining that night when the family last sat together, and then vanished. The grand staircase was brittle, but intact. As I ascended, a faint echo rose, the sound of wood sighing under strain. My lamp caught fragments of family portraits lining the wall, their faces mottled with mold. Yet despite decay, their eyes seemed fixed, unyielding, following me upward. On the landing, I felt it. The subtle shift, the atmosphere tightening, a pressure in the air, neither breeze nor draft, but something heavier. My breath quickened without reason. The nursery door stood ajar. I entered. Small iron bedsteads remained, their frames rusted but upright. A doll lay collapsed in the corner, its porcelain face shattered, one painted eye intact. I crouched to examine it, and for a moment I thought I heard something faint, the hum of a lullaby, distant, too soft to be real. I stood quickly, pulse hammering, but the silence returned. From there, I entered the study. Shelves still clung to a few volumes, their spines split. Papers littered the floor, water-stained, words blurred into illegibility. Only one book remained dry, tucked high above reach. I pulled it down with care. Its cover bore the family crest. Inside were not words, but a ledger of names, each line struck through with ink. Some entries bore symbols, circles, crosses, and marks I did not recognize. The last pages ended abruptly, as though halted mid-ritual. It was then I heard it, the faint scrape of movement from the floor above. A pause, then another. Not the settling of beams, but deliberate, pacing steps. I held still, the lamp trembling in my hand. The sound continued, a slow tread across boards overhead. I told myself it was an animal, perhaps a fox, but the rhythm betrayed it. Too steady, too measured. I waited until silence returned. My instinct urged retreat. Yet the file, the testimony, The decades of rumor all pressed me onward. I had come too far to turn back. I ascended the narrow servants' stairs, each step groaning. The corridor above was colder, the air thin and stale. Doors lined both sides, half open, revealing chambers stripped bare. At the far end, one door remained closed. Its handle gleamed faintly, as though polished by recent touch. I reached out, hand trembling, and laid my fingers upon it. The wood was cold, unnaturally so. I pressed. The door creaked open. Inside was emptiness. A chamber stripped to stone walls, floor bare. Yet in the dust lay a single impression, recent and distinct, the outline of a footstep. The footprint unsettled me more than any superstition could. Dust covered the entire floor in an undisturbed shroud, except for that one impression. It was recent. Too recent. I crouched low, tracing the outline with my lamp. It was not the bare mark of a villager's shoe. This was narrower, elongated, the heel faintly pointed. It carried the elegance of another century, as if someone still walked the halls in shoes belonging to the Verlaine era. I rose, my throat dry. The room was bare, but its walls drew my attention. One panel of stone appeared darker than the rest, less weathered. I pressed my palm against it. The cold there was different, not simply of time, but of space behind it. A hollow. I searched until my hand brushed a narrow groove, nearly invisible. I pushed, and with a reluctant sigh, the wall shifted. A panel slid inward, revealing a narrow passage descending into darkness. The air that escaped was thick, almost chemical in its sharpness, as though it had been sealed for decades. I hesitated at the threshold. The lamp flickered, throwing long shadows across the walls. A silence pressed against my ears, dense and unnatural. Still, I stepped inside. The passage narrowed quickly, stone walls slick with damp. My shoulders brushed them as I descended. Steps spiraled downward into the earth. Each footfall echoed, overlapping with the faint drip of unseen water. At last, the stairs opened into a chamber. My lamp revealed a vaulted ceiling, my walls carved with unfamiliar marks. Not writing, but symbols, circles intersecting, jagged lines, arrangements that unsettled the eye. In the center stood a long table of stone, its surface etched with grooves. Stains darkened the channels, rust-brown in hue. Around it lay fragments of objects. Cracked chalices, remnants of wax candles melted into the floor, bones too small to belong to animals. I felt the air thin. My chest tightened as if the room itself resisted intrusion. Yet I forced myself closer. Among the debris lay a bundle of documents sealed in oilskin. Time had preserved them. My hands shook as I untied the cord and unfolded the brittle sheets. They were records, names again, this time with dates, each one aligning with a year of reported disappearances from nearby villages. Children, adolescents, travelers. The entries continued for decades. At the final page, the handwriting shifted. It was bolder, almost frantic. It spoke not of rituals of devotion, but of necessity. The bloodline must not fracture. The gift demands renewal. I lowered the papers, my lamp dimming as if choked by the stale air. Then a sound, a soft scrape, not behind me, but above. Dust sifted down through cracks in the ceiling. Something or someone moved in the ruined house above the chamber. I extinguished the lamp and stood in darkness, heartbeat thunderous. The scrape became footsteps, then silence. In that silence, another awareness grew in me, that the Verlaine estate was not simply abandoned. It was guarded. I held my breath in the darkness, the extinguished lamp still warm in my palm. Above me, silence pressed in thick waves, yet I knew I was not alone. Whoever had stirred the dust above remained still now, listening perhaps as intently as I was. Minutes bled into each other. My heart thudded so loudly I feared it would betray me. Finally, I lit the lamp again, shielding its glow with my coat. The chamber returned, its grotesque symbols and long-forgotten objects glimmering like relics of fevered devotion. But my attention lingered on the papers I had uncovered. I turned back to the records. The handwriting that had grown frantic toward the final pages seemed almost to confess. One phrase repeated, "The inheritance must be protected." The implication was clear. The Verlaine bloodline, with its wealth and influence, had not vanished through tragedy alone. It had been managed. Each disappearance, each unexplained loss in the surrounding countryside appeared to have fed into this cycle. A new theory began to take shape in my mind. The Verlaine family had not merely disappeared, they had perhaps been absorbed, consumed in a continuum of ritual designed to preserve a legacy in secrecy. If true, then the estate was not deserted, but occupied still by those who carried that duty. The scrape above returned, this time closer. I snuffed the lamp once more and crept to the stairwell. The stone steps were slick, forcing me to move slowly. Every shift of my boot felt deafening. When I reached the landing, faint light spilled down, moonlight through broken shutters above. Then a shadow moved across it. I froze. The silhouette was slender, not the broad outline of a man, but something leaner, almost delicate. The figure lingered at the top of the stairs, then turned away. I heard a door creak, then close with deliberate slowness. Whoever it was knew these halls. I forced myself upward, every nerve alight. Reaching the entry room, I found it empty, though a faint smell of oil lingered, like freshly lit lamps. My eyes adjusted to the darkness, and I saw new disturbances in the dust. More footprints weaving between mine. I followed them into the corridor where the moonlight barely touched the floor. The trail ended at a door I had not forced open before, one that had been swollen shut by damp. Now it stood ajar, as though inviting me. I pushed it gently. The hinges groaned. Inside, a smaller chamber lay waiting. Unlike the others, this one was preserved. The furniture was intact, a writing desk, a mirror tarnished by age, a chair with fabric still clinging to its frame. Dust lay on every surface, except the desk. There, a single candle burned. Its flame trembled as if acknowledging my arrival. Beside it sat another book, unsealed, its pages open to the middle. In ink still black and wet, fresh words sprawled, "You should not have come." I stepped back, pulse hammering. The ink was not yet dry. Whoever had written it had been in the room moments before. Perhaps they were still in the house, watching. The candle flickered violently, though no draft reached it. The mirror caught my reflection, pale, drawn, and behind it, in its murky depths, something else. A figure, indistinct, standing at the far corner of the room where the shadows pooled deepest. I spun, but the corner was empty. Only silence greeted me. Yet the impression lingered, and with it the growing certainty that the Verlaine mystery was no longer a tale of the past. It lived on, embodied by those who still stalked these corridors. And I realized with cold clarity, I was not merely an investigator of their secret. I had become a trespasser within it. The silence in that preserved room felt heavy, almost staged, as though the candle, the open journal, and even the mirror had been left deliberately for me. I backed toward the door, fighting the instinct to flee. Yet every step deeper into fear seemed to pull me closer to the heart of the mystery. I forced myself to look again at the journal. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, as if written under duress. The words sprawled across the open page. Blood is memory. The line must endure. Strangers must not disturb the balance. A faint sound stirred behind me, not from the corner this time, but from the hallway. Slow, deliberate steps approached. I extinguished the candle with my fingers, plunging the room into darkness. My pulse beat in my throat as I pressed against the wall. The steps halted at the threshold. Then a voice, low and steady, spoke. "You've come further than the others." I held still, not trusting my voice. The figure stepped into the room. Moonlight from the cracked shutters caught their face. It was a woman, her features lined, but not aged in the way one might expect. Her eyes carried a sharp, almost unnatural clarity. "You seek the Verlaine family," she said, tilting her head, "but you've mistaken absence for silence." I found my voice. "What happened to them?" Her gaze lingered on me, measuring, as though deciding how much to reveal. Then she said softly, "They never left. Not truly. They are here, as I am here. We are the keepers of the inheritance." Her words tightened something in my chest. The journals had hinted at continuity, but hearing it aloud confirmed what I dreaded. The Verlaine bloodline had not vanished. It had been folded into secrecy, perpetuated in rituals hidden from history. She moved closer, her steps noiseless across the dust. "Those who trespass become part of the cycle," she whispered. "Their memory is consumed, their names forgotten, their lives woven into ours. That is why your predecessors never returned." The implication struck me cold. Other investigators had come here before me. None had lived to tell what they found. I tried to steady my breath. "And what becomes of me?" I asked. She smiled faintly, though it did not reach her eyes. "That depends. You can carry the burden of silence, or you can carry the weight of blood." Her meaning was clear. I could leave with my memory of this night, but not without consequence. Or I could remain absorbed into the very story I had come to uncover. The room seemed to close in around me. Behind her, the mirror once again caught our reflections, though in it her figure looked distorted, taller, more angular, her features stretched into something inhuman. She saw me glance at it and turned sharply, covering the glass with a cloth. "It is not for your eyes," she said, voice sharpened now. The air between us thickened with something unspoken. She was the guardian, the last visible face of the Verlaine legacy, and I realized that pressing her further would risk crossing into whatever fate had consumed the rest. Still, I forced the question that had haunted me since I began this investigation. "Why?" My voice cracked in the stillness. "Why preserve this at all?" Her answer was almost tender. "Because memory must be fed. The world forgets too easily, but we do not. The Verlaine name cannot die." Her words hung in the air like a curse. Then, in one swift movement, she stepped past me, extinguished the journal's candle completely, and slipped into the hallway. Her presence dissolved into the shadows with unnatural ease, leaving only the echo of her footsteps. I was alone again, yet not free. For the first time, I felt the weight of choice bearing down on me. Leave and live with silence, or stay and risk becoming another vanished name swallowed by the Verlaine legacy. And as the house seemed to breathe around me, I realized my time to decide was running out. I stood frozen in the dim hallway, her footsteps dissolving into silence. My body urged me to run, but my mind told me there was one final thread I had to pull before leaving this place. The last door at the end of the corridor beckoned. Its wood was marked by strange etchings, half-erased symbols carved deeply long ago. I reached for the handle, half expecting it to resist, but it gave easily, swinging inward with a groan. Inside was no furnished chamber, but a vault. Stone walls, low ceiling, the smell of damp earth. Candles lined the walls, some still burning faintly. At the center stood a long wooden table, and on it lay records, ledgers, and folded sheets of parchment. My pulse slowed as I approached. These were not random notes. They were genealogical documents, carefully charted family trees, stretching back centuries. The Verlaine name wove through them like a dark thread. Yet alongside it were names of outsiders, written and then struck through. At the bottom of one sheet I read in chilling clarity, "Those taken into silence, their memory sustains the line." The truth crystallized. The disappearances across decades were no accident, no tragedy of chance. The Verlaine family had perfected a ritualized form of survival, consuming the identity, memory, and even blood of others to preserve their own continuity. The guardian was not protecting ruins. She was maintaining an ongoing covenant. A final journal on the table bore yesterday's date. The entry was addressed not to the family, but to me. "You are the last one who will be allowed to know. Choose your silence, or join us in the walls." I left the house at dawn. The air was bitter, carrying the weight of unspoken names. I never saw the guardian again. But in the weeks that followed, I received anonymous parcels, blank envelopes containing small scraps of paper, each with the faint outline of my own handwriting, torn from notes I had kept during the investigation. The message was clear. They were watching. My choice of silence would not be a one-time act, but a lifetime's burden. And so, the Verlaine mystery remains unresolved in the official record. But I know, as surely as the echo of that woman's voice still lingers, that the family never truly disappeared. They are there still, hidden, waiting, enduring. And so the story of the Verlaine disappearances reaches its end. What began as scattered rumors of a noble family's strange vanishing reveals itself as something far darker, not a disappearance, but a continuation in secrecy. The Verlaine bloodline survives, not through natural succession, but through a ritual of silence and erasure. Every missing investigator, every lost traveler, every name that failed to return home became another thread in their tapestry. I carry the knowledge carefully now, as one carries a fragile glass in the dark. Speaking too much of what I found risks drawing their attention. Yet silence too is heavy, because silence allows the story to repeat itself, generation after generation. Perhaps that is why I share it here, not as confession, but as a warning. When you hear of a house left to rot in the countryside, of doors that open to rooms too well preserved, or mirrors that reflect more than they should, step back. Some legacies are not meant to be disturbed. As you drift now into rest, let your thoughts soften. Leave the corridors of that house behind. Let the shadows fade and let the night embrace you gently. If you found this story unsettling, I invite you to support these nights of storytelling by liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing where you are listening from, along with the time on your clock right now. Your comments are not only welcome, they are part of the living archive of these quiet investigations. And with that, the Verlaine mystery closes, a door that should perhaps never have been opened, now slowly shutting again. Open quote, open quote, open quote, end of story. Wishing you a peaceful night's sleep.